My name is John Geer. I'm a professor of political science here at Vanderbilt, and this is my colleague, Dave Lewis. And we have the honor and the good fortune and the fun to be able to come to you and speak to you today about President Obama after 16 months. As Professor Lewis was just telling me, that so grateful that we didn't have just 15 months, because that extra month is going to give us so much more to talk about. But it's really great for a variety of reasons to be able to be here, but partly because all of you have entrusted your sons and daughters to Vanderbilt for 4 years, or perhaps in some cases a little longer, and we appreciate those tuition dollars. But it's something that we take seriously and something that we're honored by. And so this is obviously a great day, and then tomorrow becomes an even greater day. But we do want to talk a little bit about Obama and about the last 16 months. But I want to start out with a comment or an observation that David and I are both political scientists, and we take that term seriously in the sense that we try to be objective. This is obviously an era of partisanship where people may feel strongly for or against Obama or for or against President Bush or whatever, and we want to try to scrape that away. Because what we really want to try to do is to be objective in our discussions. Not that we're perfectly objective, but among faculty, you actually have up here people who have voted for Democrats and Republicans. It is true. Most people think faculty only vote for Democrats or perhaps socialists or whatever opportunity they have, but you do have a bit of bipartisanship here. And I raise that partly because I really do want this to be, and Dave and I have worked hard on this, is to try to be nonpartisan, try to give you some information. And we're going to talk for about 30 minutes, Dave?
Yeah.
And then we'll have take your questions and try to be a conversation. I mean, this isn't very formal. In fact, one of the things we're going to do is shut down, well, I don't even know how to shut this. This is a Mac. I'm going to work offline. Maybe you can take it down. You don't need our pictures. We're here in flesh, and we're much better looking than those pictures. But what I thought I'd start off with, and then I'm going to turn over to my friend and colleague, Dave Lewis, is talk a little bit about presidential greatness. And the reason for that is that anytime you try to take stock of a president, oftentimes the news media or other people will turn to the question, is Obama going to be a great president? Well, let's just start with the beginning. It's way, way, way too early to even make any kind of assessment about Obama being a great president. The term is interesting. Historians spend a lot of time, and sometimes political science join them, ranking presidents. We know that there's a consistent belief that Lincoln was the best president among historians and political scientists, with FDR and George Washington being in those top three. But when you start talking about presidential greatness at this time and try to make an assessment about Obama, inevitably you get into partisan comments. You get into partisanship because there's no way we get the distance. In fact, President Bush, who when leaving office, lots of news media and other commentators said, oh, he's going to be the worst president ever. That was obviously wrong. That's obviously premature. And in fact, there's some reanalysis going on now of Bush, and it will continue. I mean, heck, all you need is David McCullough to write a book about you, and you can suddenly go from not so great a president like John Adams to a really great president. So there's lots of ways to move these things. If you happened to be in August of 1864, more than a few years ago, Lincoln was by all standards a failed president. The Civil War was not going well. There was no assessment of him being anything but a one-term president. He was going to lose his re-election struggle. He was in deep, deep trouble. This was August 1864. By April 1865, he's assassinated. The war has been successfully fought, and all of a sudden he goes to the ages and is now ranked by everybody as our greatest president. Things can turn around. Things can turn around for President Bush. They can turn around good or bad for President Obama. I will say that President Obama standing among us, that is among the public, is a little below average right now. His public opinion rating, his approval rating is 50%. There have been a number of presidents since not the Civil War, the World War II, that have done better, such as Richard Nixon in his first term, such as Dwight Eisenhower, Bill Clinton by a little bit. Both Bushes did better. Actually, Ronald Reagan, who is likely to be viewed as a near great president at least, his popularity was below Obama's than at this point in time. And that's important for a little bit of context because Reagan obviously went on to have a very successful presidency by any kind of standard. And so again, these ratings are pretty soft. Jimmy Carter was below Ronald Reagan. He had the worst ratings, which doesn't necessarily surprise a lot of you, I suppose. But nonetheless, Obama's at about 50%. And that's pretty good. If he is at 50% come August of 2012, he's almost sure to be reelected. And so he's doing okay, at least in popularity. But we want to talk more about that, and I want to turn over now to my friend and colleague, Dave Lewis. And let me just say a couple of things about Dave before I turn it over. One of the things about Vanderbilt that I love is the students and the opportunity to teach students. But the other thing that makes Vanderbilt a unique institution is the seriousness with which we take research. And so you really have to do both, teaching and you have to do research to be successful here as a member of the faculty. And Dave, in fact, is an example of both of that, both through his teaching and, in fact, having written an award-winning book on presidential appointments, which was great timing for him, but serious awards by his peers that indicate both his success in the research and we all know at Vanderbilt his success in teaching. So with that modest introduction, I'm now going to turn it over to Dave to talk a little bit about Obama's accomplishments to give them a little bit more feeling than just a few popularity polls.
All right, well, that was a great setup. So I don't know what I can say now. I think I should just step aside. I was talking with my wife last night. I said, you know, I was going through and say, what should I talk about? Here are the things I think I'm going to talk about. And there was a long section where I was going to talk about presidential appointments. And my students probably who have been in my class can confirm this. I get very enthusiastic when I talk about presidential appointments. But she said, you know, that really is super boring. So you may want to stick to something that's more interesting. So I'll do that. So as John said, it's perilous to talk about presidential greatness at this point in a president's term. But that said, we like to play this game, and I think there are some hints in what Obama's done these first 16 months that will give us some idea or some purchase on this general question of how's he doing? Has he been successful or not successful? We're always a little cautious when we do this, not just because it's hard, but also because there can be an activist bias that creeps into these evaluations, right? So if we say we want to evaluate presidents on how they've stewarded the economy or on security or on their success in legislation, if we do these things, there is a sense in which we're trying to say, what have they done visibly? What legislation have they passed? And that gives rise to this hint that we like presidents who do things as opposed to presidents who don't, but it's an open question as to whether presidents who do things, that has passed lots of legislation, are the presidents that you want at every point in time. So I'll just lay that caveat out there beforehand. But let's talk a little bit about policy. So one way we might evaluate President Obama in terms of his actions or success is to say, has he accomplished what he set out to accomplish? Has he done what he campaigned on? And there are lots of ways to answer that question. Let me talk about one. Let's talk about policy. One of the perils in evaluating what someone's done in their first 16 months is that we like to count. We like to say, okay, well, how much have they done? Have they passed lots of pieces of legislation? Have they implemented lots of executive orders? Have they made lots of visible speeches? In the case of legislation, I think we'd immediately turn to the health care bill, and we'd probably turn to the stimulus bill. But most of us would be hard-pressed to say much more, right? And there's even some, blogosphere criticism of the administration in the first 16 months around this basis, sort of saying, well, what's he done exactly? And that question was even more serious prior to the enactment of health care. But let me say that I think this approach of counting what presidents have done is a little bit misleading, and it's misleading in the following sense. If you look at the legislation that's been passed, it's been large in terms of magnitude. That is, the health care bill is a serious change in American politics, both fiscally but also in terms of social policy. The stimulus bill is a tremendously large piece of legislation. And embedded in that legislation were a number of provisions that helped Obama accomplish things that he had promised that he would do. So, for example, there's money for infrastructure that he had talked about. There's money for green jobs, something he had campaigned on. There's money for education reform, something that he had campaigned on. The tax cuts that show up in the stimulus bill look a lot like what the tax cuts were that he talked about during the campaign. And so if you unpack the stimulus bill, it looks like there's been a lot more legislative or policy accomplishment than we thought in the first place. Now, what's ironic about this, right, is if you remember back to the debates in 2008, and I'm sure that you do, there was this question asked by the moderator in one of the debates, basically saying, look, the economy is going in the tank, the amount of money that's going to come in terms of revenue is going down. How are you going to pare back all the promises that you've made? What are the things you're not going to pay for? And that was a legitimate question at the time, right? We sort of thought, yeah, that's right. If there's less money to go around, what is it that we're going to not spend money on? And neither McCain nor Senator McCain nor Senator Obama at the time gave a very good response to that question. But what's ironic about the economic crisis is that it provided an opportunity to pass this big stimulus bill. There was sort of a consensus that a stimulus bill is necessary, and it created a window of opportunity for Obama to get done a lot of what he had promised he would do in his first year. And so that's important to remember. Now, of course, moving forward, evaluating his success on this dimension is going to depend on things like the success of the cap and trade legislation, financial reform, and so forth. Let me just say a couple of quick things about other aspects of his stewardship in office. The first is the economy. So the economy is a troubling thing for presidents because they're held accountable for it, but they actually, if you look at it, don't have a ton of influence over it. So they have incentives to do what they can, but also present themselves as having been successful here. And the economy is troubling for two reasons. One is it's hard for presidents and for the public to evaluate exactly what it is that presidents have done. So at some point in his first term, I think John and I would agree, the public's going to start to blame Obama for the state of the economy, or they're going to start to give him credit for the state of the economy, even though the causes of the economic collapse, the success or failure of the recovery, if it comes, those are complicated causal stories to tell. And whether the president himself has played an important role or not is difficult to discern. And it's partly the previous administrations and the Fed and so forth that caused or have some blame or credit to share in whatever happens. And so that's hard. And it's coming, right? People are already beginning to say, oh, it's, the economic crisis, we blame Obama as opposed to the previous administration. The second difficulty here is that we don't see the counterfactual, right? We don't see what the economy would look like if Obama had done nothing, and we don't see what would have happened had Obama taken different actions. All we get to see is what he did do and try to evaluate on the basis of that with very little to compare it to. So that's difficult. And in some ways, the story with security is similar. That is, we don't get to see how many terrorist attacks are deterred. We don't get to see how many people thought they might attack the United States but then decided not to based on security measures or the things that the U.S. has done. And I think that John and I would agree that if there's a terrorist attack in the next couple of years, the way that we evaluate this presidency and the way that we evaluate the previous presidency are going to change dramatically. That's going to rise to the top of the issue agenda. There'll be an initial support for whoever's the president after a terrorist attack, but then there'll be recrimination. And part of how we'll evaluate the Bush presidency is going to be dependent on what happens with subsequent presidents and security. So those three things, legislation, the state of the economy, and security, I think, are ways that we evaluate presidents, and there are some hints in there about what to do about Obama. So those things are also, I think, going to influence the midterm elections, and I'll let John talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, because obviously we have the 2010 elections coming up and then 2012 past that. And one of the things that political science has to bring to the table is actually a pretty good understanding about how elections work. We really have a lot of good data. It's been collected mostly since World War II, and there have been a huge number of very talented individuals analyzing it. So we've got a pretty good handle on that. So for example, in this upcoming 2010 election, unless something really bizarre happens, the Republicans will gain seats in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. That is the typical pattern. Since the Civil War, the president's party has lost seats in the midterm election except for about 3 cases. And so it's a pretty general pattern, and you take a look at the kind of anger that's out there right now, very likely there's going to be some serious change. However, the extent of that change is very hard to predict at this point in time. Because one of the things we also know about midterm elections is that the state of the economy and the president's popularity will minimize those losses if the economy is doing well and if the popularity is high. And of course, the economy and popularity are tied together. That is that if the economy soars, Obama's popularity will soar. If the economy struggles more, Obama's popularity will suffer. Right now, his popularity he still has a little bit of a honeymoon effect at 50% because the economy is in fact struggling though by some indications, like gain in the Dow, et cetera, there's been clear recovery, but on the job front, it's pretty clear there hasn't been very much and not a lot is forthcoming. But if indeed the economy begins to come around, that's going to minimize these losses. And that's really the key variable. And it's a frustrating variable for presidents, just as Dave said, because they don't necessarily have a lot of control over it. Bill Clinton was really lucky in 1996 to happen to be in office while the economy was rolling. Yes, he helped it a little bit, but he got lucky. George Bush 1, got unlucky in 1992. If he had run about a year later and the economy was rolling, he likely would have won re-election, but he was running at an unlucky time. And you can kind of go back and forward. Jimmy Carter was unlucky. Ronald Reagan was lucky. So there's a lot of that, but we need to know what the economy is doing. And there is some unique features of this economy because it was in such bad shape. Not only when does Obama start to get blamed for it, but also by what standard do they judge him on? That is, do they compare him to the dangers that were unfolding in January of 2009, or do they just judge it by general kind of economic indicators? And again, we just don't have a lot of feel for that. But the House and the Senate is likely to gain Republican strength. The chances of taking over by the Republicans, either branch, is not very high. A lot of people make the comparison to 1994 and the Contract for America and the fact the Republicans did win both the Senate and the House for the first time in 50 years. That seems unlikely. But again, a big tide against the Democrats could sweep enough people in. More likely, the Senate is in trouble for the Democrats by 12 because they'll be protecting a lot of seats in 2012 that they won in 2006. Remember, 6-year terms? So there's a lot of vulnerability. So when you accumulate the loss of 10, which I assume they're going to lose some seats, and then the vulnerability they have in 12, that's really when the likely time the Republicans have a real good shot at taking over the Senate. The House, again, it's quite possible, but we need to know more about the state of the economy and the kinds of successes that the Obama administration has or lack thereof. One question a lot of people ask is the Tea Party, which I would first of all love somebody to define with me any precision what is the Tea Party, but that's a different issue. It's an anger, people angry with the size of government, et cetera. How this will cut isn't entirely clear. The Tea Party movement, for example, could turn Florida to the Democrats because they're going to split. The Frist is going to, not Frist, I'm showing my Tennessee roots here. Frist is running as an independent, and that could split enough votes to allow the Democrats to win. Utah's just seen an effect. I mean, we don't know what will all unfold on that front. But the Tea Party movement is not a unique movement. The kind of anger that you see usually comes from the party in power, the ideological edge of the other side, usually complains in some ways. The Tea Party movement has had particular teeth this year, partly because of the state of the economy. But again, if the economy starts to do really well, the Tea Party will start to suffer. It's a product of right now interaction with the size of government and the fact that things on the economy continue to struggle. I'm not convinced that health care will matter much in the midterm debates. I would focus much more on the state of the economy and see what the economy looks like in July or August, because what happens in the economy structures the kind of campaigns candidates can run. In 1984, Ronald Reagan ran one of the great campaigns of all time. It was called the Morning in America campaign. He ran a masterful campaign, and he had beautiful ads with children running in fields and parents watching their children get married and kids buying new homes. The economy was rolling, and he could run that kind of campaign. In 2004, George Bush could not run an optimistic campaign. Why? Because there was concerns about terrorism and the economy was struggling. So instead, he had a lot of tough ads. In fact, there was one ad, a very famous ad called the Wolves ad, which suggesting that basically, if he's not president, the wolves are going to get us, i.e. the terrorists. Very hard-hitting kind of ad, totally fair game, in my opinion, but not a Morning in America ad. But why? Because the context was different. So if the economy is doing well, that will allow the Democrats to run a very different kind of campaign than if it's not doing well. And we know right now it's struggling, but we'll see what these kind of economic indicators suggest and also what consumer sentiment does. Finally, let me just say a few words about 12. Obama has a very high chance of being reelected, a very high chance. And I base that not on any partisan statement, but simply the data. The country does not change horses in midstream very often, especially when they just did the previous election. Jimmy Carter is about the only time we can find where the parties changed in 76 from Republican to Democrat and then they went back again. It doesn't happen very much. It's also true that by 12 the economy is likely to be doing better, and Obama will certainly try to claim all the credit for it. And right now the GOP does not have a clear frontrunner. However, by 2010 that could change. And what I mean by that is that the election is likely to produce somebody who suddenly looks very presidential, at least potentially presidential. So at this point in time, we just don't know, but history suggests that Obama's in pretty good shape. But, you know, the same thing was being said about George Herbert Walker Bush, and maybe Jimmy Carter back in his time as well. But nonetheless, I mean, structurally, the things are aligned for Obama. I mean, he chose to run at about the best time you could possibly run in 2008. I mean, the economy was struggling like mad. I mean, it was the perfect time for any Democrat to win. That was part of the reason why, I mean, there were many reasons why Hillary Clinton was frustrated by it, but this was the year the Democrats were going to win, whether it be Obama or Hillary Clinton. John Edwards probably would not have won. But I think I can say that. I don't have any data, but what the heck, I'm going to say. Pay attention to popularity ratings. As I said, if he stays around 50%, you know, that is Obama, not Edwards. Obama's still doing pretty well. So for 2010, you know, the Republicans seem to be on the upswing, but we'll see what happens in 12. And there's still a lot of politics to unfold, but Dave's now going to take a look a little bit at the upcoming future, for instance, of the Obama administration.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump off where John left off, which is this expectation that Republicans are going to pick up seats in the House and in the Senate. And one of the things I tell my students to do in my presidency class is to develop the ability to predict what's likely to happen given certain changes in the political environment. And so, in fact, I get to the advantage here of getting to cheat, which is I gave this essay question in my class this last semester, and I basically said, what's Obama likely to do if he, you know, moving forward in his term? And so the students now get to hear how I would have answered that question. So let me say a little bit about that. So given that we have this expectation that Obama's likely to lose seats, that's normal. There is, as John suggests, a lot of energy, probably more energy on the right than on the left for the midterm elections, and that usually results in better performance because these are low turnout elections. So what's likely to change? Well, I would identify three things in particular. The first thing that's likely to change is that the president's strategy in terms of the types of issues that he focuses on is going to change. In a sort of obvious and concrete way, the president's more likely now to focus on cross-cutting issues. That is, issues either where there's broad agreement among the parties about that something needs to be done, or issues on which the president can split the parties. That is, take part of the Democratic Party, part of the Republican Party, and build a coalition around that. So I'm thinking here about issues like budget deficits. Everybody's against budget deficits. We can maybe come to some agreement about how to reduce spending or deal with budget deficits. Everybody agrees on that. There are different approaches to how to get there, but I think that would be one thing. Immigration's another issue that splits the parties in terms of the way that the parties think about it. There are different people in each of the parties that has very, very different opinions about immigration, and so the president could make some moves in that direction. So that's one thing. I think I'd also expect the president to take some more political issues, ones where he thinks there will be electoral advantage to pick them up. So this is a common, this is sort of blame game politics, right? That you pick an issue on which the other party is unpopular, and you bring that issue up and make a vote out of it, right? So I think that the President Obama will find issues through, White House does an extensive polling apparatus, as do the parties. Find those issues on which Democrats have a clear position and where the Republican position is unpopular with the majority of the public, or at least unpopular in key places like battleground states or in competitive districts, and bring those issues to the fore and really talk about them and even try to force votes on those issues so that Republicans are put in a difficult position. Either a position where they're going to have to take a public stand that's unpopular, that could hurt their electoral chances, or take a stand that's going to split the party, that's going to divide the Republican Party as it is. And part of the way that I think that Republicans are responding to the Kagan nomination for the Supreme Court has a bit of this flavor to it, that they're kind of trying to figure out what the right position is to take. If they go against Kagan, is it going to play well electorally or not? And I think there is some sense on the part of the White House that Kagan's nomination will play well for them, and they're happy to have that fight if the Republicans want to have it. The last strategy, I think, which is common in the second part of the first term or in second terms, is to focus on policy making that can happen without congressional involvement. And by that, I mean things like foreign policy, right? So the president's latitude to negotiate treaties, to try to bring peace, to establish their legacy through foreign policy, is something in the modern presidency that happens a lot without direct congressional involvement. That's a historical anomaly in some senses. The modern presidency is different than the early presidency in this way. But presidents in the modern period have really grown their power in foreign policy. And when legislating is difficult, foreign policy is the place they go to establish their credentials and establish their legacy. The other thing that presidents tend to do when legislating is difficult is to make policy on their own through things like executive orders or presidential directives, right? So you take something that's the equivalent of, say, the stem cell research decision. That doesn't require congressional involvement per se to sort of issue an executive order, but look for other issues like that for presidents to make the president to make very visible public moves with executive orders or presidential directives that will move his policy agenda forward in a way that Congress is sort of left in this position of just carping as opposed to being able to legislate in response. The last thing I'll say before John and I turn this over to you to get your opinions and open it up for questions and discussion, is a stylistic thing. And one of the things that characterizes the modern presidency, a strategy that modern presidents have employed, I think to great success, particularly in some periods, is the public appeal. Right? You go on television, you talk over the heads of members of Congress, and you tell voters, contact your member of Congress, tell them to vote a particular way on this piece of legislation. The archetypal example of this is Reagan and the tax cuts early in his presidency. The difficulty for presidents subsequent to that has been a difficulty getting the public's attention. It's harder to get people to watch televised addresses. The market for it is smaller. There are more options given the internet and cable television. And so it's harder and harder for presidents to go public in an effective way. But one of the innovations of the Obama presidency allows him to go public in a way that other presidents have not before him. And that is his campaign organization, Obama for America, has been transformed into a continuing organization called Organizing for America, where part of the campaign apparatus has continued on into his presidency so that the president has a continuing connection with voters that they connected with during the campaign, and they can use that or mobilize that set of voters in a way that influences the political system. And in some cases, you could argue that the president has a closer connection to voters in particular congressional districts than those members of Congress have themselves. And so it'll be interesting to see the extent to which the president tries to augment that resource and then also use that resource to push legislation through that he has to get through. In fact, I think many of us, I could probably poll in this audience, there's some of us that have had some connection to the Obama campaign through an email or whatever. Many of you probably got emails subsequently during the healthcare debate saying, please contact your member of Congress, this is what's going on with healthcare, and so forth. And so I expect that tool to continue to play out. We don't know how effective it will be, but I think that will be interesting to watch moving forward as well. So that's kind of my take on what's going to happen, and should we just open it up for comments and discussion?
I think we should. Well, we have a quick hand up there.
You were just describing the sea change that took place in the 2008 election and Obama's use of the internet to great effect. President Obama came out against the Supreme Court's decision unfettering corporate spending on advertising and campaign advertising. What's the connection between the two? What is the connection between opposing corporate spending and he having discovered very effectively the use of a very powerful advertising tool that doesn't fit with traditional advertising in the past?
Well, I mean let me try to take a stab at it, and then Dave. Oh, yeah, good point. Sorry. Yes, good. Thank you for doing it. Basically, the question is that Obama, during the 2008 campaign, and if I mischaracterize it, of course, let me know, made good use of the internet and used the internet to bring in a huge amount of contributions, record-breaking contributions. Yet the Supreme Court, when they ruled allowing corporate money to enter the campaign, he came out opposed to that. And how do you reconcile those two? Well, I mean, my personal view is how you reconcile them is it's just political. That is that the corporate money is likely to help the Republicans on average. There is the unions can also join, so that'll help the Democrats a little bit. I mean, Obama understands that partly through the internet that Dave was just describing and you were alluding to, he's going to be able to raise a huge amount of money in the campaign. And in fact, with the new Supreme Court decision, there's going to be even more money spent in the upcoming political campaign. So his opposition to it is much to do with politics and the fact that he thinks it'll help the Republican Party. There's also a question about what constitutes free speech. And that's a conceptual issue that is not something that I've thought a huge amount about, but the court as an institution over the last 20 years has really believed that corporations have a right to kind of air a message that they want. And people are worried about the amount of money being spent in the campaign. For instance, there was $1 billion approximately spent in the 2008 presidential campaign. And people are always bothered by that. I wouldn't be very bothered by that. I mean, because this is an important choice. We need to know what these candidates stand for, and this information clearly provides opportunities for the public to learn. And if you try to constrain people's rights to say what they want, I always get a little bit nervous about that. And the amount of money that's spent is quite a bit, but just think about the advertising budgets of companies like Toyota or Charmin bathroom tissue, and you begin to realize, wait a second, I mean, there's just a lot of money being spent in advertising. And also, I have a huge faith just in the American public. That is that the public's able to sort this stuff out, and if somebody's trying to basically create a campaign about how wonderful they are and they aren't, that'll get unfolded. But I think in the end it's a lot political, though Obama would disagree with some of that by arguing that it's an issue of what constitutes free speech. But I don't know if you want to take a
I wouldn't say too much more. I mean, I think I defer to your expertise on that, John. The one thing I thought was interesting about that whole episode, though, was Obama's explicit mention of this decision in the State of the Union address. And we rarely see this kind of overt questioning of court decisions by presidents. I mean, it's happened in the past. Andrew Jackson famously said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And, FDR, campaigned tongue-in-cheek to, that the judges were getting too old, we need to expand the size of the Supreme Court. But that was in an earlier period. And so this event where the president says, hey, the Supreme Court made a decision that isn't the right way to interpret the Constitution is an interesting moment, because we have this reverence for the court that in some ways is based on this sort of idea that somehow judges are different from everybody else in the way that they look at the law and the Constitution. You might ask yourself, why do judges wear robes? Why do judges have symbols around them? In a cynical way, they're politicians just like everybody else is, and so maybe the president's able to interpret the Constitution just as well as the Supreme Court. But we live on this fiction, or well, I don't want to call it a fiction per se, but we live in this world where, the legitimacy of the court depends on our belief that all they do is read the law and apply it. And that's going to come to the fore in the debates over Supreme Court nominees. And so it's a really interesting moment for the presidency, I think.
Yeah, in the green.
You said that in the next several months, the Democrats should focus on issues where they get a clear position that's broadly popular and Republicans don't. Do you have some examples of those issues?
I could probably make a lot of money if I had all of them nailed down. What's interesting is I actually thought healthcare was one of these issues until the debate began about it, and then I think it sort of turned. I think there was sort of broad popularity until the healthcare debate began, and then the public relations battle was won in such a way that the public by the end was actually really suspicious of the healthcare reform. I do think that Supreme Court nominations are one of these cases where I think that the White House does believe that they can have a debate about quality. So the presidents prior to Obama, so even if you look at President Bush's appointees to the Supreme Court, so look at Robertson, Alito, impeccable legal credentials, right? It's really hard publicly to argue that they aren't qualified to be judges, right? And I think it's equally difficult to argue that Kagan is not qualified. Clerk for Thurgood Marshall, Dean of Harvard Law School, widely respected in terms of what she's written. And publicly, it's difficult to say, oh, but this person isn't the right person for the Supreme Court, even given these credentials. But Republicans are really in a difficult position because they think Kagan's going to be liberal on the court, and she's going to be there for a long time. And so they may feel some pressure to vote against her, even though they voted for her, many of them, when she was nominated to be Solicitor General. So I think that's a fight they're willing to have, and I think that's part of the reason why they chose her relative to somebody else that they might choose. I don't know, John, do you have any other?
Well, the financial reform stuff, I think, is an issue that the Democrats at first didn't look like they were getting traction, and then they managed to win a rare public relations battle with the Republicans, saying this is, you're basically a tool of Wall Street if you don't support this. And something's going to come and probably be passed next week, and I wouldn't be surprised by July that some sort of package, with bipartisan support, by the way, because it's an issue that's very popular, going after Wall Street. But a lot of these things, as Dave just indicated, what makes politics so interesting is that you think an issue on the face of it, healthcare reform and having healthcare available for all Americans, is a pretty easy sell, right? At one level, if you ask people, do you think Americans should have access to health care, people are going to say yes. But it's much more complicated, and so then you get this duel between the two sides on which, who's able to frame it in an effective kind of way. And so there's a lot of times it's hard to anticipate because some issue is suddenly reframed. For instance, immigration. Prior to the Arizona action by the state legislature and then signing, immigration really wasn't on the agenda, but all of a sudden now it becomes a different issue because of the particulars of that law, which I'm no expert, but now that's changed. So that a lot of these things are, we call it endogenous. Basically, the political process generates them. Imagine, for example, tomorrow, if Barack Obama comes out and says, I want to have a constitutional amendment to make this country a Christian nation. He isn't going to do that. But just imagine if he did. All of a sudden, the whole agenda is completely blown up and things change because it isn't just a matter of what the problems are out there. It's how people choose to address them, and then that interaction plays out. And then you have two sides of the coin. I mean, we need, both sides. I mean, people always say, well, you're Republican or Democrat. Well, in the end, I like to have both parties because if there was only one party that had all the ideas, guess what? We'd only have one party. And the reason we have two is because some are right sometimes, and that battle is really critical, and that battle leads to better policy too. So, but I think the anti-Wall Street thing, jobs are going to be an issue. I mean, they got that job stimulus package. It wasn't huge, but why'd they get that through? Because, legislators want to be able to go to the districts and say we got jobs. Yeah.
Speaking of two parties where majority rules, can you see what just happened in England happening here, where a third minority party can really become a swing party?
The question was, is there a chance for a third party, like in the case of Britain, coming up and having that kind of effect? Actually, there's a Wall Street Journal poll that I stumbled across yesterday that the support for the two-party system is at the lowest point. 51% of the country thinks the two-party system is working, and like 30 or so percent want a third party. This is, Ross Perot in 1992, there was certainly a big push for a third party, and Perot ran an amazingly successful campaign. The problem is that our electoral laws are really shaped to favor a two-party system. Because Ross Perot got 20% of the vote. How much representation did he get? Zip. I mean, absolutely none. And so that if indeed you have a third party that runs, but somebody still wins the college, the electoral college, that is, they become president. I mean, Lincoln got 39% of the popular vote in 1860.
I'm speaking more in the House.
Right. Well, but even the House favors. Our electoral system favors two parties because we have something called first past the post, which means that whoever wins the most votes wins the election. Now, if you changed it to you had to have a majority of the votes, or you changed it to proportional representation, that is that rather than having one congressional district represented by one individual, you changed every congressional district to be represented by 10 individuals, and then you said somebody gets 60% of the vote, they get 6 of those 10, 3, then all of a sudden, that's when you have countries have third parties. I remember there was somebody who made an argument once in an article, it was a terrible article, that said, well, the Europeans just have more complicated politics, that's why they have more more parties. It's just the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. And in fact, that's just not the case. It's the laws. That is, the electoral laws are very different. So is it possible? Yes, but what likely happens is it's a short-term thing and then one of the party absorbs them. So that's
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is extremely difficult. And historically, what's happened when these third-party movements have arisen is that the parties have adjusted. So, for example, Ross Perot runs, and then what happens? A number of the things that were in the contract with America were things that Perot himself and his supporters had campaigned on were important to them. And so the major parties adjust. in a way that makes it difficult for those third parties to sustain a unique identity. If it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen in local races first, where the costs of organizing are much lower, and so you'd have to sort of start it there. In a congressional race, you're talking about thousands and thousands of voters, and it's just, I think, as John rightly said, the deck is stacked against third parties.
Now, it could happen that another party comes up and replaces one of the parties. I mean, the Republicans were a new party in the 1850s, and they came up. And so that I would not want to claim that the Democrats and Republicans are always going to be the two parties. But you might have a short-term three-party system, but it's going to blow up pretty quickly, and then there'll still be two. And they might still have those labels, or they might be literally different labels. Over here.
Given the concerns that exist over the deficit, where do you see Obama and Congress going regarding tax policy?
You notice the questions I take and I don't take. I actually restate the question so that...
Okay, so the question was, given the deficit, where do you see the administration going with regard to tax policy? Is that fair? I think it's politically difficult to raise taxes, as I'm sure you know, and so nobody wants to run on a campaign of raising taxes. So I think part of Obama's proposal to do this budget deficit commission is to generate political cover for enough actors in the system to have a package of policies, including some types of taxes. They want some political cover. So you create a commission, the commission makes a recommendation, a set of packages that everybody can sort of focus around, and then they vote on it. So I think that's where things are headed. If they do increase taxes, it's going to come with increased spending. That is, they're going to sort of raise taxes, but they're going to raise more than they need to some extent to buy off different people that need to be bought off to have them join the coalition. I think it's fiscally necessary probably to raise taxes or cut spending. One of those two things. I think everybody recognizes that. Politically, nobody wants to do either one of those things. So the commission is the sort of intermediate step to getting there. Whether they tackle it, I think they want to wait and see what a commission would recommend.
Let's take one over there. And then, yes, ma'am.
You haven't spoken much about the effect of foreign policy on the opinion of the president. It seems to me that sometimes the retrospective of the effectiveness of the president is sometimes judged by foreign policy more than economic. I think Mr. Johnson's war in Vietnam sometimes overshadowing his economic achievements in society. China, well, on that one. But comment to some extent on where you see Obama's fulfilling his promise to withdraw troops from Iraq. During Afghanistan, but his fulfilling their promise and what effect that might have. Overshadowed by all the other factors,
Well, I'll take I promised Dave I would take a stab at the first foreign policy question, because neither one of us are super experts on this and it's complicated.
I let the smarter person talk first.
Well, we know that's not true, but nonetheless, the question was, for those of you who didn't hear, is basically how does I'm shortening it down, but basically how does foreign policy play into this, and especially given the possibility that Obama may not fulfill his promises on Iraq, and I'll even go further and say that we have the war now accelerated in Afghanistan, though he did indicate during the campaign that he was likely to do that. How is that going to play in light of the economy, and does it get swept kind of under the rug? Is that fair? Okay. Well, first of all, the economy is the issue, okay, and that's just the way it is, and it's sometimes frustrating, but it's what drives elections, and what's going to drive for the most part, Obama's presidency. Now, terrorism, as Dave suggested earlier, lurks in the background. That is, that if all of a sudden there is a terrorist attack, all bets are off, things change dramatically. But right now, the country has been kept safe from a terrorist attack, which again, if you think about the counterfactual, it is something that really President Bush is likely to get credit for down the road in a really serious way, because unfortunately, the chances of something happening down the road are significant, and then you all of a sudden change your evaluation. So there's not much to do. The public cares about the economy, and that's what really matters. Now, there are times when a war crops up, like Iraq was really unpopular, especially following the 2004 election, and it really hurt President Bush. And if, in fact, Afghanistan becomes a quagmire, which it could easily, that's going to hurt Obama. And it could be in a way that might be, let's say the economy's middling, and Afghanistan's a real problem. That might be enough to get him out of office. It's conceivable. So really the domestic stuff drives things, but when there's a big issue that comes up, and terrorism is obviously the most recent one, but popular and unpopular wars, makes a difference. The American public has a strong penchant, and they've shown this traditionally over a long span of time of really, and these aren't, people forget these simple things, but they do favor peace and they favor prosperity, and for the most part the public likes moderation. And if you take a look at the presidents who have been successful, it's those who have fulfilled all of those. Now, sometimes you're forced into a war, like happened with Roosevelt, but if it's successfully fought, you get huge amounts of credit. And in fact, if you look at the presidential greatness scale, the people who are great are the ones who have fought successful wars and have dealt with huge problems, usually often economic problems. So that's why FDR is up there. That's why Lincoln, because he dealt with the biggest crisis of this country. And Washington actually has moved up in recent years, partly because he was dealing with so many new things that he was able to navigate those waters. But foreign policy just tends not to matter as much. And it's just, in some ways, a frustration, but on certain issues it will crop up. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, it disappeared. In the 1992 campaign, I would don't do this, I've done it. Look through all the advertisements of Clinton and Bush and find out how many times they talked about foreign policy, and it's zero. They didn't at all. And the irony is that President Bush is, during his time, the Berlin Wall falls. The Gulf War was fought successfully, at least by some standards, but it wasn't mentioned at all in the campaign. It's one of the realities of American politics. I don't think it's unique either. People want jobs and a strong economy. But I told you I'd take the first foreign policy question.
No, you covered a lot of ground. The only thing I would say is I'd make a distinction between the way that voters, the importance of foreign policy to voters, and the importance of foreign policy in terms of historical legacy. And I think John was hinting at that Obama's beginning more, shuttle diplomacy between, in the Middle East, between Israel and Palestine. If, Iraq is peaceful and democratic 10 years from now, that'll change the way we evaluate him, but it also changed the way we evaluate Bush's presidency, right? If Iraq is peaceful and democratic 10 years from now, people will think maybe it was worth it, maybe that was the right decision. But I think John's right. Unless there's something unusual happening in a war where there are casualties involved, that does have a drag on elections. But short of that, foreign policy isn't usually at the top of the agenda. It's usually something else.
Go ahead. You pick one now.
The gentleman there in the back.
To what extent do you think personality, likability, or respect the president as a person tends to contrast to the political economic policy?
Restate the questions.
Oh, yeah. So the question was, how much does personality, likability, charisma, is that a fair statement? How much that influences elections? Is that a fair question? Also, a little bit, John, you want to sort of jump in. I think, the first thing you want to think about in elections is, how do people vote? And people vote generally on the basis of their party ID. So if you sort of subtract out all the people that vote on the basis of their party ID, that is the self-identifying Republicans, the self-identifying Democrats, you're left with this kind of messy middle. The messy middle are a group of people who are independent, and they're often independent because they don't pay much attention to politics or care about politics. And for this group, these, what we call valence characteristics, can matter a lot in terms of their evaluation of the president. In terms of partisans, it doesn't matter as much, except to the extent that it mobilizes them more than they would have otherwise been mobilized. Maybe encourages them to give more money or makes it more likely for them to turn out where they wouldn't have turned out before. So I would say it matters, but it kind of matters on the margins, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why I think it matters on the margins is that imagine, for example, the economy soars, Afghanistan is solved, and the deficit comes down, taxes are low, we're in the perfect society. All of a sudden, Obama is really this thoughtful, really clever person who understood all these things. Now imagine this other scenario, the wheels fall off totally the wagon. He's hesitant. He doesn't, he spends all his time thinking about problems rather than solving them. So you can take any kind of personality trait and make it positive or negative. George Bush was somebody who stuck to his guns, but when things went bad, he was stubborn. So you have to be worried a little bit about that. It's also true that the American public really does care about policy in ways that are often subtle. And a good example of that is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, and it drove Republicans absolutely out of their minds. But when the Lewinsky scandal hit, everybody assumed that Clinton's popularity ratings would go down. They soared. Okay, I can remember just thinking, it was just absolutely hysterical. People were apoplectic. How could this happen? Now, people didn't like him personally. They thought he was, slimeball, right? Okay, true. But he was governing during a time of prosperity. The country was at peace, and he was pretty moderate. And his popularity went up. I mean, it was just one of the most amazing things. So here's somebody who suddenly becomes less likable, and yet his approval ratings go up. It was one of the great amazing things about Clinton. I mean, Clinton is one of the master politicians. I always tease people that if Bill Clinton could have run in 2000, he would have won easily, and he could have had Monica Lewinsky as his running mate wearing the blue dress, and he would have won. And that's not a partisan statement. That's a statement of just simple political skill. There's certain individuals, and he was among them. Richard Nixon was another one who had huge, amazing political skills, but not necessarily Mr. Likability either.
To be fair, though, I think our perceptions of Bill Clinton are influenced by the win in '92, right? If Ross Perot had not run in '92, there's a very good chance that George H.W. Bush would have been reelected, and then our perceptions of his skill as a politician and his, the campaign that he ran, everything would have been entirely different than it was. So it is one of these things where our perceptions of people's personality and the traits that we focus on as being good or bad are influenced by these, idiosyncratic events.
The winner gets to decide history. Go ahead, Dave, pick another one.
This gentleman.
I'm really thrilled to be here because you all can finally get to a closure on an issue that I don't understand at all.
Well, no, that's not probably true at all.
It's true. I know it's true. I've heard a lot of noise about this. I have no clue what the answer is. That's why I want to ask you this question. Is there any evidence at all that supports that President Obama should not be president because of his birth certificate?
If you want,
I'm no expert on birth certificates, and so there's enough evidence to satisfy me, but I know it's not enough to satisfy many people. But
I think the key problem is that being born in Hawaii just raises problems. I think that's the key problem. I saw an announcement of saw some newspaper clip somebody sent around, I don't know whether it was legitimate or not. I mean, yes, I agree with Dave that there's enough evidence that if in fact it was real concerns, it would have been brought out. I think this is an example of both, you can think of it as good or bad about the internet. That is that the internet gives rise to these kinds of I call it extreme view or whatever, and there's extreme views on the left, and it gets more airing. And that's actually a good thing because, we need to have all those kinds of discussions. But I think I wouldn't worry about it. And I would believe that John Roberts would not have been willing to give him a second crack at the oath of office if he had doubts. But it's a concern out there, and we have colleagues.
Yeah.
Well, rephrase that. We have a colleague who believes that this is a real concern, and I take that person's concern seriously. I just haven't seen any evidence to suggest that it's legitimate. Good, David.
The woman on the far side there.
You touched on it a few minutes ago, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective, both of you, on the 2000 election and the legitimacy of it, and what you told your students that fall.
The question is the legitimacy of the 2000 election. I have to start out because I was in the committee that was planning the Gore Presidential Library, and so I was really very disappointed by the whole outcome. I don't know that Al Gore would put his presidential library, by the way, at Vanderbilt, but nonetheless, this is again one of these examples of a partisan charged issue. But let's just talk about the evidence, kind of following up. Same thing. The evidence is that Gore had more votes in Florida than Bush, and people on both sides of the aisle have added up. That's clearly the case. But what I think we fail to forget is that our ability to measure outcomes of elections, this was a flip of a coin, this election, flipped the coin, and it came down in the favor of Bush in some sense. There is enough measurement error in our electoral system, which got highlighted in the Florida case, that there were a lot of doubts about it. But, you know, there's been, if you go back to the 1960 election, there's a lot of doubts about the legitimacy of Kennedy's win. When you have a really close election, you can always come up and try to argue one way or the other. Out of that whole debate that unfolded in 2000, and actually I was teaching a course with a friend of mine here at Vanderbilt, actually in this room, on the 2000 election, and it looked like a course that was never going to end for a period of time. And, you know, it was an election that was driven by partisanship. And what I mean by that is whether you thought Bush or Gore really won was driven by whether you were a Democrat. The Supreme Court of Florida was dominated by Democrats. They ruled in favor of Gore. And then with a Republican edge in the Supreme Court, they ruled in favor of Bush. It was determined by party. But it was a really close election. And I think there's other issues that don't get talked about, like the Electoral College. You know, there are some people who will argue, why did Gore let it be so close? Because the conditions favored Gore. You know, it's a tough issue. But current political science, recounting the votes, Gore won Florida. But at the time, you know, that wasn't at all clear. And that was this has been a 2-year, you know, it wasn't known until about 2002, 2003. But the political system took a hit. And there was a lot of people who didn't view Bush as legitimate. But then over time, that's been eased, and that was a black eye for the system for a short period of time, but not one that was long-lasting. And frankly, we all have a vested interest, and Vice President Gore deserves a heck of a lot of credit for, after the Supreme Court's decision, despite the advice of a lot of people, he just said, I'm congratulating Governor Bush. I mean, he could have created a constitutional crisis, but he didn't, because somebody had to win, and it was a flip of a coin, and it's an issue that still gets people riled up in ways that are understandable.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir, in the middle.
In view of your work on presidential appointments, what is your feeling about Senate procedure? Is it anti-democratic? Filibuster majority interpretation of advice and consent? How does that affect the president's
Well, I think it makes it extraordinarily difficult. I mean, the different. Oh, yeah, sorry, thank you. The question was about the Senate's role in advice and consent and its effect on the appointment process. And one of the things that we've seen over the last, say, 15 years is a dramatic increase in the amount of time it takes for nominees to be confirmed. And because of the increased vetting and the length of time it takes in the Senate, there's also a length on the front end. It takes a lot longer for presidents to name people to positions because of fears about what's going to happen to them in the Senate. And so the process has lengthened so that you can have President Kennedy more or less have his team in place several months into the administration. And now President Obama's in his 16th month, and only 70% of his Senate-confirmed positions have been filled. And on average, Senate-confirmed positions are vacant 25% of the time. And a lot of this has to do with this sort of extraordinary power that the Senate has over confirmation. Part of the difference is the polarization of the parties. That's one explanation for why it's taking longer. The other is the willingness of individual senators to use their prerogatives in the Senate to slow things down, to put holds on nominees that are backed up by the threat of a filibuster. So individual senators have so much power to shut down Senate process that they can hold these things hostage. And the increasing polarization of the parties has politicized the nomination process in a way that individual senators have a stronger incentive now than in the past to take these prerogatives and use them for this purpose. And it's a real problem. I mean, so there's no head of the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. There's no head of the Transportation Security Administration. Many of the key management positions in government are still vacant because the Senate has not acted or the president has not named. And a lot of that has to do with the dynamics of the confirmation process.
We have time for one more question. Way in the back, somebody? Yeah.
Well, I would actually expand that question about the filibuster problem in general, and where you see that panning out over the next near future. Is that something that the public is kind of in tune enough with procedure in the Senate to care that the Republicans are acting obstructionist? Or is it the kind of thing that Obama's not getting anything done? Obama's just not making any progress because nothing's happening. So, or is it really that big of a problem? And we just got a 96-0 vote on auditing the Fed, and we're going to get bipartisan support for financial reform, so maybe it'll all just dissolve.
Go ahead.
I'll take a crack, which is, I think that it's only in rare circumstances that the public is paying close enough attention. I mean, there's always I don't want to disparage the public in general, because there's always a a subset of the public that, you know, likes politics, pays attention to the news and so forth, and has a pretty sophisticated understanding of what's happening in politics. The general public, the ones that are likely to be pivotal in any election, only is episodically attentive to what's going on in Washington. And so there are these moments where the filibuster is politicized in such a way that, you know, pressure to break a filibuster or to stop filibustering can be placed on individual members because they worry about re-election. But I think that's only episodically. And so I don't see it going anywhere. I don't see them changing the rules on cloture. I think it's going to be there in the long run. But there will be these moments on big issues where it'll sort of draw attention. I think the health care bill was one of these cases where people did know and did care about Senate procedure, but I think that's an exception.
Well, we've got to wrap it up, but before we wrap it up, I just want to thank all of you for coming, but also for letting your kids come here to as I call it, Camp Vandy. And it's just great fun, and enjoy this day and enjoy tomorrow, and we applaud you.